Hello, it's Samuel. As with any succession of leaders, there are good leaders and there are leaders who are not so good. Those are leaders we call bad leaders. And in this case, we are going to be talking about some of the, how should we say, lesser leaders of Roman history, these being the bad emperors. My criteria for assessing what makes an emperor good or bad is kind of arbitrary, but needless to say, I've generally stuck with consensus here on who's generally seen as good and who's generally seen as bad. So I'm not going to go out anywhere on left field and say Nero was a great emperor or something like that. That being said, I think I can explain some of the picks that I've decided to leave off of the list. The first of which would be Tiberius. And he's probably the closest one out of the list that I've got here that really could have made this list, but simply by providing the stability and making sure that the empire didn't immediately collapse after Augustus is something that I give him credit for, and really it's good enough for me even if he wasn't personally invested in doing any of that. Domitian is another one. He was very much disliked by the senatorial class, and he didn't really like them either. But giving the benefit of the doubt that most of his detractors come from simply having felt the wrath of Domitian, and that he wasn't actually a bad leader, just a fairly ruthless and efficient one, I think we will leave him off there. Maximian is another one, and even if it could be said that he was incompetent, he was at least good enough for Diocletian to work with, even if by his own rights he wasn't a great leader, but I don't know if that necessarily makes him a bad one. Maxentius, again, his Maximian's son, he did have to face probably one of the most competent and talented Roman emperors, so I cut him a bit of slack for that. Valens, he was put in an extremely difficult circumstance that I don't really hold him entirely responsible for, so there. Unlike a few emperors, he actually seemed invested in doing a good job, but he was just unlucky to be placed in one of the most difficult circumstances. Another point to make before carrying on, there is a saying that goes something like this. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. This is something that you'll probably see pop up, everywhere in life, but I just think it's a good thing to keep in mind as we go through this list to just kind of think about that and see where things fit in or where they don't. It's a good interpretive lens. Two of the earliest emperors that I think we can really pin as being bad are, no surprise, the third and the fifth respectively, this being Caligula and Nero. When Caligula came to power after the death of his great-uncle Tiberius, he was about 24 years old, and much of his life prior to this had been either with his father and family, Germanicus, or else in seclusion on Capri with his adopted father and great-uncle Tiberius, who may have also murdered Caligula's father, Germanicus, and Caligula would have been aware of this, which is kind of awkward. Like many of his contemporaries on this list, Caligula seemed to be prone to sexual deviancy, something which many senatorial class people suffered through, but I shall not bear repeating here. There's no other way to say it really, but Caligula was quite sadistic, and maybe his extremely troubled younger life helped contribute to this. Prior to his ascension, of course, he hadn't had any formal government or military experience. He also continued the proscriptions, which had been revived under Tiberius, which, as we can imagine, were very unpopular, and this, amongst other deranged things, eventually led to his assassination by the Praetorian Guard. It seems he had made few friends, and so he wasn't long for the world. Nero, on the other hand, was even younger than Caligula when he became emperor, being only about 16 years old. Although, importantly, he would have been recognized as having been an adult by the Romans of his time. Again, both because of his being born into the imperial family and being so young, he had very little experience. He seems to have been a sort of a wild character, much like his uncle Caligula. Yes, that's weird to think about. However, his longer reign indicates that there was some level of stability across not only the empire, but especially in Rome. For at least a while, there was peace between the senators and the emperor, unlike the instability that existed between Caligula and the senators. It would, of course, be during the reign of Nero that Paulinus famously crushed the Celtic rebellion in Britannia, so not everything in the empire was going terribly. However, the elephant in the room for Nero is the persecution of the Christians. Now, whether you think that Nero was involved with the Great Fire of Rome, it seems fairly clear that the Christians ended up with the short end of the stick, and the Neronian persecutions expectations would begin the tradition of Roman persecution of Christians that wouldn't really end completely until well into the reign of Constantine, and even then up to Theodosius. And that's a bit of hyperbole, because of course there might have been persecution of the Christians by Romans, but this is kind of where the greater tradition begins. Nero is certainly vilified as one of the worst emperors, chiefly because of the Christian persecutions, although it is important to remember that, like Caligula, the people writing about how bad he was were also the same people that tried to take him down in the end. Biased sources, but they are what we have to go off of, so we'll take them. Commodus is very famously another one of these so-called bad emperors. He was the only surviving son of Marcus Aurelius, and he had been primed to rule since he was born. He is one of the few early emperors who directly succeeded his father, and even more rarely, he was born when his father was already the emperor. Surprisingly, this is a trend that we don't see very often. The expectation from the day he was born that he would one day rule was always there. However, the other temptations, which came from being almost the most important man in the known world, and that man's successor, was also very present. Commodus was a great fan of the games and LARPing. I mean, you can see here him dressed up as Hercules. He didn't really have the same personal interest in safeguarding the imperial borders or expanding them as his father and imperial predecessors had done. The era of the five good emperors would come to a whimper with Commodus and kind of just fade and sputter out, which is, when you think about it, the five good emperors were some of the greatest emperors that Rome ever saw, and to end in such a pitiful way really just kind of looks pathetic. But that's what happened. Again, we might also take into account that Commodus's 12-year reign is pretty good for emperors, and it seems that there was some sort of stability that existed, although how much we could credit or discredit him for it is not for this video to discuss. And so now, of course, we come to the Severin Dynasty, which is a bit of a mixed bag. Septimius and Alexander were actually kind of alright. Septimius definitely the best, and Alexander defied expectations by being young and not being awful, which, as we continue along, we'll see there's a bit of a trend there. All of the guys in the middle, however, are either insane, bloodthirsty, spoiled, or all of the above. Geta and Caracalla were the sons of Septimius Severus, and would be the first pair of brothers to reign as co-emperors since Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, and they were spoiled. Both brothers were born before their father became emperor, but when he did, they were still young, so it seems that the imperial spoilage effect really took hold. Geta doesn't have as long of a reign as his brother, reason being that his brother is probably the person who assassinated him in front of their mother, so that's kind of awkward. Caracalla was also a bit of a nutbar himself. He had a pretty large ego, it would be a bit of an understatement to say that, and this made him very unpopular. He was eventually assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, which leads us to Elagabalus. Although there is an emperor kind of in between, we don't really care about him. If you thought any of the previous emperors we've discussed were crazy or had any preconceived notions about them, Elagabalus is simply critically insane and a pretty complete sexual deviant as well. I highly recommend you look into that if you're willing, but if you're not, I understand that. Really, I do. Again, like all the other emperors that have come before, these were all very young guys. Caracalla was the oldest of the three, and he became emperor at age 21. Hardly very old, and frankly, that's an age that I'm very familiar with. On the other hand, Elagabalus was 14. At the very least, it can be said that accompanying their father, Geta and Caracalla had some experience. They were amidst the milieu of the Roman soldiery, but it was not enough to really make them mature rulers. The crisis of the 3rd century, I suppose I need to explain a little bit here because it doesn't seem I've selected anybody specifically. The crisis of the 3rd century was kind of long. There were a lot of emperors in a short amount of time. I think if you look at it, there were about... Well, I'm not going to get into that. I can't be bothered really to sift through each and every one to confirm or deny whether they are good or bad. So instead, the lowdown is this. There were some good emperors during the 3rd century crisis. Aurelian immediately springs to mind. The Illyrians were generally pretty alright as well. But there are also a lot of screw-ups. and it certainly didn't help that they were getting cycled through very rapidly. There were at least 26 different emperors, depending on how you count, and even more usurpers trying to claim that position, making the turnover rate of almost one emperor every 2 years if you take the average, which, in terms of stability, is not very good. Now, of course, not all of the instability of the empire can solely be placed in the hands of the emperors during this period of time, and it really shouldn't also just be solely characterized as a problem of leadership, although that was a large factor. External factors played a very important role in destabilizing the empire, which helped also to contribute to the rise of poor, weak, and bad emperors. Now, Panorius and Arcadius, these guys make me very sad. Especially Honorius, but anyways. Both were the sons of the short-lived Emperor Theodosius, who, despite actually being emperor for a longish time, was only the emperor of a united Rome for a little less than a year, I think, eventually passing the west and the east to his young sons Honorius, to the west, and Arcadius, to the east. The big problem with these guys is that they were incapable of ruling in their own right. This partially owed to the fact that they both came to the imperial throne very young. Arcadius was 17 and Honorius was 10. So you're not really setting yourself up very much for success. What ended up happening is, like I said, being unable to rule in their own rights, power really lay in the hands of their more competent but perhaps less benevolent advisors. We think of Eutropius, Stilicho, Aelia Eudoxia, these types of figures. The captain of the military, I forget what the name is, but that's too bad. Wives, advisors, stuff like that really kind of becomes the locus of where power is. And even though imperial power really did reside with the emperor, and could still be taken advantage of by those offering a better deal, or those trying to get ahead, the power usually really lay in the hands of a select number of individuals who had control of the army and the guard. I think the thing that really makes me sad about Honorius is that he has an exceptionally long reign, and he basically did nothing the whole time, which is sad, but that's simply the reality that the Romans were living under as the empire was collapsing around them. Oh well. Now that we've roughly gone over everything, let's see if we can find some maybe common links. The first thing that we can easily take note of is that out of all the emperors I've listed, they've all been very young at their ascension. This isn't to say that old men always make for great emperors, and indeed, we see many men during the 3rd century crisis who are not old or not young, but who definitely fall short of being an okay emperor. For our young emperors, going hand in hand with that, is that they all lacked experience for the most part, which comes from being youthful, not knowing who to trust and not being able to make decisions within your own right, or as some emperors like Caligula can attest, being able to make decisions, but really they're all very negative for anyone not named Caligula. Another factor that we can apply is the spoilage factor, which is to say that not an insignificant number of the emperors I've listed were spoiled from the time of their birth, raised with the proverbial silver spoon. This isn't a hard rule, however, as we have examples where those who were destined for the imperial throne very early on were not spoiled, Marcus Aurelius, of course, being the chief example of this. Marcus Aurelius and Commodus really captured the dichotomy of Roman imperial rule. It's interesting that it came about to be that way, but on the one hand you have one of the greatest, and on the other hand you have one of the not greatest, one of the worst. The X factor that I've added there could really be anything, but it's basically anything that can't be neatly packaged away to fit for everyone. This could be something like Caligula's sadistic insanity, Nero's preoccupation with becoming the greatest musician, and apparently he was quite a good musician according to Suetonius, LARPing as Hercules in the gladiatorial games like Commodus, or just being a bit of a douche like Caracalla and ordering seafood as soon as you got away from the ocean where it actually became difficult to get. And there's also other X factors too, like what's going on in the empire, who you have as your subordinates, etc. Really, what we can certainly say is that without any doubt that there is a legacy of Roman leadership here. And like any leadership, we see examples of emperors who were very evil, very bad, and at the same time, we also see emperors that were very good. By the same mark, of course, bad emperors are no more exception than they are the rule, even if they did come from even if they were succeeding their father, or even if they weren't. There really isn't any way to properly say who will be a good emperor or bad emperor just based on who their parents are, although sometimes that can certainly be a help. What can be said is that Roman emperors very often are a mixed bag, some being better, some being worse, some being great, and some being very bad. Some even being bad emperors who fell on this list. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I guess we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.